All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have some folks filing in. Today we're going to be going over some really cool content. Quality by design, shifting left with centralized test automation and management. Uh, Really exciting presentation we have for you today. We are doing more of these collaborative webinars between our different Sembi brands. Thank you very much for participating. Speaking of thank you, I want to say we have two great speakers today. Devin Jones, Solution Architect for QA automation at Sembi, focusing specifically on a lot of the Ranorex topics that we'll be talking about today. Patricia Mateus, Solution Architect at TestRail. Both of them are very capable of talking about this topic because they've done the job before. So you're going to be hearing directly from them and their experience and how we can help in those brands. As far as the agenda goes, we're going to be talking a little bit about what's going on in QA today, and you know how we've seen teams build modern QA workflows, designing tests with automation readiness, parallelization, which I know Devin loves to say that word, development and test automation, and then TestRail and Ranorex integration workflows. We speak to a lot of teams about this topic. And a lot of teams still have, a way to go in their test automation journey. And so hopefully this presentation will equip you with some information to bridge that gap in the future. And we're going to be ending with some Q&A at the end, and that's when you will hear my annoying voice again. But for now, Devin, why don't you take us away?
I'm going to get started by highlighting some data from the first edition of the Sembi Software Quality Pulse Report. These metrics are compiled based on the input from around 4,000 software quality and security professionals. The top priorities reported by respondents were automating more tests, reducing bugs found in production, increasing test coverage, streamlining the QA process, and shifting left. As for the main challenges, end-to-end testing across integrated systems, time limitations, writing test code, managing data in test environments, and not having enough QA resources topped the list. A little more than half were happy with their current QA process, and nearly half were neutral or dissatisfied. And an average percent of end-to-end test coverage was 57%. In the AI space, 53% of respondents' code was AI generated or assisted, and demand for QA is extremely high, but the majority of teams are reporting either no or only a minor positive impact with bringing in these AI tools. And I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Patricia Mateus, who's going to be telling you about building a modern QA workflow.
Hello, everyone. Also, I was introduced before, but I didn't have the chance to say hello. So Devin has presented some figures and some numbers, but now it's the time to look at some of the challenges that QA teams are facing today. And I would like to shift the conversation toward how can we build a more modern QA workflow. So one of the biggest changes we're seeing across the industry is that quality can no longer be treated as just a phase that happens at the end of the development. Instead, QA needs to be considered throughout the entire delivery process. When QA, both manual and automated, and development activities are connected from the beginning, teams can move faster and at the same time reduce rework and create a much more scalable testing strategy. And that's exactly what we'll focus on the next sections. How to build quality into the process from day one, and how TestRail and Ranorex can support that approach together. So when speaking with QA leaders, we often hear very similar goals and challenges. Teams want to increase test coverage, accelerate the adoption of AI, and reduce the number of defects reaching production. But actually, the main challenge that the teams face is that reality often gets in the way. As applications become more complex, end-to-end testing becomes more difficult to maintain. Teams are expected to do more with the same resources. And while AI can certainly help increase the productivity, it also introduces new requirements around validation, code review, and also, of course, skills development. At the same time, organizations are trying to move faster than ever, which increases the pressure on QA teams. These goals are absolutely achievable, but they require a more connected and scalable approach to quality. This slide illustrates a workflow that will probably look familiar to many teams. Traditionally, development work happens first, and QA activities follow afterward. Testing becomes dependent on development being completed before meaningful validation can begin. As a result, QA often becomes a bottleneck near the end of the sprint. Defects are discovered later, feedback cycles become longer, and automation work is pushed further down the timeline. What we want to achieve instead is greater parallelization between development and QA activities, allowing testing preparation and automation planning to begin much earlier in the process. When people think about automation, they often think about scripting tools and automation frameworks. But in reality, automation scalability starts much earlier. The quality of your automated testing is heavily influenced by the quality of your manual test design. If the test cases are well structured, clearly written, and consistent since the beginning, they become much easier to automate later. Automation engineers will spend less time interpreting requirements and more time creating reliable automated coverage. By designing tests with automation in mind from the beginning, teams can create a stronger foundation for long-term automation success. So you might ask, what actually makes a test case automation ready? First, we will want to avoid anything that requires interpretation, as generic titles, vague validations, or unclear expectations that often create confusion and make automation much harder to implement reliably. Instead, we should focus on deterministic actions and explicit expected results. Reusable workflows, modular structures, and consistent naming convention also play an important role because they make tests easier to maintain and easier to map into automation framework. So the goal is simple. If two different people read the same test case, they should reach exactly the same understanding of what needs to be validated. This example that you now see shows a test case that may work for manual testing, but creates challenges when we try to automate it. The wording is generic, the validation isn't clearly defined, and the expected outcome depends on human interpretation. When the automation engineer receives test cases like this, they often need additional clarification before implementation can even begin, which creates delays, increase effort, and introduces the risk of inconsistent automation. This is one of the reasons why investing time in test design pays off later into the automation lifecycle. Now let's compare with this automation-ready version. Notice how the navigation flow is clearly defined, the validations are explicit, and the overall structure is much easier to understand. This type of test case is significantly easier to translate into an automated workflow because there is very little room for interpretation. It also improves maintainability over time since updates can be made more consistently whenever the application changes. And ultimately, good test design reduces complexity for everyone involved. Beyond the individual test case itself, project organization also matter for automation. In TestRail, we generally recommend using multiple test suites whenever the structure makes sense for the project. As so, teams can organize suites by feature, component, or business workflow, and then use sections to create logical grouping within those areas. Consistency is extremely important in here. Clear naming conventions and predictable organization makes it easier for both manual testers and automation engineers to navigate larger test repos. Good structure today becomes easier automation management tomorrow. Metadata is also another area that gets often overlooked, but it can provide tremendous value. Labels, references, custom fields help to organize information beyond the test case content itself. For example, references can create traceability back to requirements, to Jira tickets, or to Azure DevOps work items. Custom fields can help to identify automation candidates, priorities, ownerships, or other information that's important to your workflow. The more meaningful context you can associate with your test assets, the easier it becomes to manage testing at scale. A well-organized TestRail project isn't just easier to manage manually, it also creates a much smoother path toward automation. When test cases are structured consistently, categorized effectively, and enriched with useful metadata, synchronization becomes easier and long-term maintenance becomes significantly more manageable. This is one of the key principles behind quality by design. Creating assets today that continue delivering value as your automation strategy evolves. And before we move along and Devon continues with the presentation, we would like to hear from you. When do you write your test automation code for new features? Please answer at the pop-up that is now presented in your screen. And Devon, I will pass to you now.
All right, everyone, you can continue to address the poll here as we continue. All right. Now I'm going to cover some strategies to help you streamline your test automation process. As Patricia stated earlier, but I cannot restate enough, if you want to make sure your automated tests are covering what they're supposed to, you need to be explicit about your steps and expected behavior. The QA engineers writing the test cases aren't always the ones automating them. The automation ticket may be assigned to another QA. You may be leveraging AI test code generators, or the job of writing automation code may fall to a different team altogether. As a former automation engineer who was frequently tasked with automating manual test cases, I get a lot of tests like this one. Say our application has multiple ways of accessing the sign-up page. Does it matter which path I take? By invalid email, do they just mean a string that doesn't contain an @ symbol or a .domain? Or is the point of the test to ensure that all form validation rules are being followed for this field, such as not allowing something like test@test.com? Or are we just trying to trigger the error once? Am I clicking the enter button or the enter key? Should both trigger the error? And does should see error just mean I should be checking for a displayed error modal, or do I also need to verify the error text? If someone not as familiar with the feature or acceptance criteria gets this ticket to automate, they'll either make their own assumptions or reach out for clarification. The former creates potential for gaps in test coverage, and the latter exacerbates our issues with limited time and resources. Now, this test I could get right to work on. I knew exactly what path to take to the sign-up page and what to enter in the email field. If I were testing the field validation, the test would tell me which test data variable to use. I know I'm clicking the button to trigger the error, and I know I'm validating both the presence of the banner and the text it contains. And just like in traditional development, repetitive code is time wasted. So we want to take every opportunity to leverage our existing classes and methods when we create new tests. Using object-oriented design, such as page object model, allows us to create reusable flows and define web element locators in one place, which we can then call from anywhere in our test suite. In Ranorex, you can easily combine one or more test step recordings into reusable recording modules, which are easy to drag and drop or copy paste from your module library. Instead of going through numerous UI steps that are already being tested elsewhere, we can navigate by going directly to URLs, making internal API calls to get the UI into the appropriate state, and generate test data programmatically. Keeping your test data and element selectors in cloud-based Excel or .csv files makes it easy for anyone to contribute to them, and most test automation frameworks have dedicated methods for reading them in. They can be added as project documents in TestRail, and the tasks of filling them in could be assigned. With Ranorex, you can directly input selectors by creating new or edit existing element repository files, and CSV or Excel test data files could be directly uploaded to your solution. All right, before we get into the next section, which is doing development and automation in parallel, I'm going to go over the results of our audience poll here. So for after the developer work has passed QA, that got the biggest percentage with 29%. As soon as the features tested, finalized, and deployed, got 13%. At the beginning of the next sprint, when I'm waiting to test tickets, 13% as well. And it looks like about 16% will start automation as soon as they know what it'll look like and what it'll do. So let's talk about some ways that you can start automating sooner. So when new features are being developed and stories are being created, mockups and UI designs are often part of planning and documentation. If you take the acceptance criteria and the developer tickets along with the UI flows, you can basically preview what UI steps will be needed and what UI changes should be validated. At this point, you can start breaking down what new elements, methods, and classes you'll need, along with what will be needed for each test that's already defined in your code base. You can define your new elements with placeholder or empty selectors, write your new page objects and helper methods, and begin assembling your tests. And when development is done, all you need to do is update your selectors, run your automated tests, and do any debugging or fine-tuning needed, which takes way less time than beginning your automation work now. When I first learned test automation, I was so excited to see a unique ID on an element until I learned how frequently these get changed. IDs are great, but developers use them for things other than just test automation. I know. So they can be just as hard to rely on as any other selector based on a CSS attribute. But creating a custom attribute that's exclusively for test automation solves that problem. The most commonly used is the data test ID, but you can collaborate with your developers to create whatever you want. I would just suggest a naming convention like page area element, so you don't end up with multiple search fields or submit buttons, because there tend to be a lot of those on single pages. Another good option is to use accessibility IDs. Since they're designed to be used by screen readers to reflect what's in the UI, developers usually leave these alone. And having good accessibility features helps users with disabilities better access your software. Regardless, developers can add the selectors for new tickets to the TestRail project, the testing ticket, or my favorite, to the selector file or document directly. If you don't want to have to define selectors yourself, with Ranorex, you can choose your element type and set the preferred attribute and condition for the automatic object recognition during click and record test creation. In this screenshot, I'm setting it to always defer to the href when the element is an A tag, but this can be done for any attribute. Then Ranorex will always generate selectors based on your preferred settings. You can also set up the rules, conditions, and even regex patterns to look for. We spoke briefly about streamlining our QA process, and you'd be surprised at how much smoother your process goes when you have well-integrated tools that enhance each other. And connecting TestRail to Ranorex is very simple. As soon as I have access to acceptance criteria and any mockups or designs or the feature, I create my test suites and test cases in TestRail. All of the manual test runs proceed. I can connect Ranorex to TestRail using the built-in wizard, and then I choose Import into Ranorex Studio. I can pick the test cases and suites that I want to import, and when the process is complete, I now have an organized backlog of all the tests I need to automate in Ranorex. Any less technical QAs or those strapped for time can create steps or tests by using the no-code click and record. You can basically create your tests while manual testing. You can also utilize low-code functionality to create new steps and drag or drop your repository items directly into them, just like we did here. You can also drag and drop or copy paste existing test steps and flows, or combine these steps into new flows. Or you can just write your own coded methods and use them anywhere in your test suite. When your automated test run has completed, the results are sent to TestRail and displayed on your TestRail dashboard. And the test result history of your tests will continue unbroken from their manual state to the CI pipeline. Now, if you have an existing automation suite, but you're new to TestRail, you may wonder what the value is of uploading already automated tests into TestRail. But having up-to-date accessible test documentation is an essential part of your automation process. With test documentation, you can more easily identify gaps in coverage, locate tests that will need to be adjusted, added to, or deleted as functionality changes, and provide non-technical stakeholders with a user-friendly way to see what's already been automated. I can tell you from experience that constantly regenerating Java docs or trying to keep years' worth of multi-tab spreadsheets up to date is no walk in the park. Luckily, with Ranorex and TestRail, there's an easier way. In the Ranorex TestRail integration wizard, just click to export to TestRail. Select whatever tests you want to export. Confirm your selection. And as you can see, each test is populated with its recording module steps in TestRail. And again, when you run your Ranorex test suite, you will see your results populate on your TestRail dashboard. And then I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague Patricia, and she's going to wrap us up.
Thank you, Devon. So as we wrap up, we'd like to leave you with a few key takeaways from today's session. First is that automation success starts long before anyone writes a script. It begins with well-designed test case, good organization, and a quality-first mindset. Secondly, TestRail can help teams create that foundation by providing structure, traceability, and visibility across the testing process. Ranorex makes easier to transform that foundation into scalable automation, regardless of the team's level of automation experience. And finally, when both platforms work together, organizations can gain a connected workflow that improves collaboration, reporting, traceability, and overall QA efficiency. We hope you've come away with some practical ideas that you can apply within your own QA process. Christian, I think we can now go to you.
All right. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation, both of you. Appreciate it. We have some questions coming in, so we're going to get to those in a second. As a reminder, if you want to ask questions, go ahead and drop them in the QA panel below. But before we do that, here comes the self-promotional part. If you guys are interested in exploring TestRail, Ranorex, any of the integrations or the Azure DevOps integration that we just launched for TestRail, the one that's been around for a while for Ranorex, all of that information is available. We'll be including it in the follow-up, so obviously you'll be able to access those. But free trials and free integration add-ons, so please do check those out. And then if you're interested more about Sembi as well, you can, or some of the insights that we shared at the beginning of the presentation on the state of the industry, things like that, you can access that at sembi.com. All right, so let's jump over into the Q&A. We are going to be joined by a few more folks. We have some extra team members joining the call: George Spratley, Rhett Devlin, and Aaron Albin, representing our test management product manager gurus. Thank you guys for joining. They're going to be here supporting if we get any curveballs that we feel like we might need some help with. All right, so there was an interesting question in the chat that George actually kind of already weighed in on, but I think it's a fun one to start with. Dev teams throughput is significantly increased with AI-based coding. This is something we're hearing everywhere, and I think it's something that everyone's trying to come to terms with. Often it happens that the previous workflows had been modified and the test cases need to be updated accordingly. With an increased throughput, it becomes hard to manage this manually. So basically, AI keeps breaking my tests, and we got to fix those, and we still got to create new tests. What are we doing? How do we fix that? George, you answered it pretty well here, but if you want to take a first stab at it.
Yeah, sure thing. Hey, everyone. Nice to see you all. So yeah, how do we handle this influx of code and code changes, and how do we make sure that our test repositories stay up to date with all those changes? So that's part of the topic we're just discussing now, and the whole idea of shifting left, right? From the TestRail perspective, the best way to keep up with these types of updates is really make sure that you have everything interconnected as much as you possibly can. Again, TestRail should be your source of truth for all things testing when it comes to coverage as well. But how would you go about this? Again, I would say using labels to identify and segregate cases into different types of product areas, levels of impact, flakiness. Well, you all understand how labels work. Just use that to add a bit more metadata. References and defect tracking as well. That's probably the most important piece. So a test cases can be linked to references. So again, if you're using Jira, for example, and every time you have a Jira user story that is related to a given test, make sure those two are linked. You can do this through Jira directly or from within the TestRail app. It doesn't matter. But what does matter is that these two things are linked. Why? So that whenever you want to go and see which ticket moved to QA, which test cases need to be updated in relation to all of that, you have that linkage. You can very easily go to your reference tool, reference management tool, or requirements management tool, and backtrack which test cases are affected by a given test case. There's a few more things that we could start to entertain when it comes to AI and other things that we're cooking internally at TestRail. But I'll pause here. I don't know, Christian, if you're wanting to go to that level of
Yeah,
depth of or
I think it's worth mentioning, but I think Aaron also weighed in on a very similar topic. Someone was asking about brittle tests, and this is probably the most common issue that we hear in test automation. You have a point of view there as well, Aaron, that's kind of more best practices based.
No, sure, absolutely. I mean, I think the number one thing is to rely on stable selectors and locators. You don't want to be having your automation interacting with elements that are likely to change. So, working with your developers ahead of time, making sure that tests are corrected if they are going to be altering those elements with their upcoming dev work, and getting ahead of that is super helpful as far as best practices are concerned. But just ensuring that what the paths that you're following are unlikely to change. Automating the most stable things first is always just a great way to be, and making sure that your assertions are also stable. So not just concentrating on locators and selectors, but at the end of every test, ideally best practices, right? You should be asserting on a result to make sure that your test was successful. So you want to assert on results that are, again, unlikely to change, ideally. So if your application, for example, has a bunch of localized strings, and those strings are subject to change by some admin or something, you don't want to assert on a string at the end of your test, because for all you know, someone could change that, then your test fails.
Excellent. Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on that one? Brittle test is a pretty common challenge, one that we're hearing a lot more of. The more you, it's sort of this double-edged sword, right? The more you automate, the more you have to maintain, the less you can automate. And so it sort of like becomes this.
I could chime in one more bit to that as well, which is you want to make sure that your test is utilizing some form of polling. You want to see if the element is there, and if the element isn't there, your test shouldn't just fail, especially if you're doing web testing, for example, because you're somewhat dependent on the server, on the page load time, things like that. Sometimes elements may take a little bit to appear. If your automation is just immediately trying to click on an element and you're not doing some form of polling or waiting for that element to be present, that can make your test very brittle as well. So I'd say, doing asserting that elements are present before your test continues can help quite a bit.
Excellent. All right. Let's keep it moving. You mentioned earlier in the presentation, test cases being automation ready. There's a question in the chat. Someone's asking, what does that mean, automation ready? How do you know when you have a good test case candidate?
I I don't mind taking this one on, Aaron. Feel free to fill any gaps if you have any. But essentially, an automation test is ready when there's no ambiguity. First, it should have been at least ran once and validated that the test is actually valid. But again, it should include a set of deterministic actions. All the test data that's required for that test to be executed should be in there as well. Aaron just mentioned assertions. That's a good example as well. What are we going to try to assert at the end of the test to validate that, in fact, it is working as it should? And again, nothing in that test should be open to human interpretation, right? That's the whole purpose of the test being automated. That should be probably one of your first classifiers. I don't know if there's anything you'd want to add to that description, Aaron, but
I think from my perspective, I'd say making sure that you have the exact locators for anything that you're going to be interacting with included with your automation test steps and description. That way, whoever's automating the tests, they may not even have to go directly into the application at that point. They can just grab those, plop them into the test, and continue onwards.
Awesome. All right. Let's keep it going. Sarath asks a little bit of a setup here. In some product development teams, QAs do the user story level testing, and in some teams, developers do the story level testing. Both have pros and cons. Which is appropriate? Oh, this is going to be a good one. I'd love to see you weigh in on this. I'm sure there's differing points of view.
I think there are times I'll jump in and then Devin, I'll hand the mic over to you. I think it depends on what you're testing. That is a big thing. If your team is maybe producing exclusively APIs, for example, I'm a big fan of following the test pyramid in general. So you should always have a lot of unit tests, of course, and that should be the bedrock of your testing. But if your team is making something like APIs, your developers can kind of kick off with the initial set of tests to cover their changes. So they make a new endpoint. Let's make a test that sends a payload that gives you a 200 or 201. Let's make a couple of negative test cases that give you 400s. Then I like to hand that over to QA and say, okay, now get creative. Let's flesh this out so that we have total coverage. So if it's something to where it's back end heavy, I find that's a great time for dev to get involved and start writing their own automation. And then it kind of the paradigm shifts the more and more UI focused you get. But Devin, I'll hand it to you.
Yeah, I would say I actually instituted a metric in my last role where we put on each ticket, like indicate who tested it, if it was a QA testing it or a developer testing it. And this wasn't a developer testing their own code. This was a developer testing other developers' code. And more bugs actually got through when it was developers checking it because developers tend to focus on specific methods, specific components, whereas QA focus on like the end user experience. So you've heard the joke about like it works on my machine. So I would agree with Aaron that unit tests, fantastic. Make sure that, if your entire job was to create a button and when you press the button, something happens, like making sure it actually works. I can't tell you how many tickets I've gotten where the ticket was just press this button and this happens, and then I pressed the button and nothing happened. But when it comes to end-to-end flows, I think QA's testing end-to-end flows when everything is integrated, the front end's with the back end, your work is with other people's work. Does it all work?
yeah,
Awesome.
Agreed. And one quick I don't want to go too deep into the anecdote and derail this, but there was one point in my career where I was managing a QA team, and there was a thought experiment that was posed to the developers where they had to tell a robot it had to, get all the balls out of this box on this grid. And I think the QA team took it on as well, and we actually beat the developers by I think 6 steps. And the reason is because you have to think creatively in QA. As a developer, you have to think linearly. That is the nature of the game. In QA, you have to think about all these other factors that go into good testing. And so I think the more variables there are in your application, I think the more you lean on your QA professionals to get all of those test cases. Whereas something like an API, again, there's fewer, I guess, variables all in all, and a lot of that can be handled by developers.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I think the anecdotes is where the goodness comes from, so the more the better. Here's another one that's a bit more detailed, but there's a template called BDD, which is behavior-driven development. Um, does this test automation does this test automation support behave correctly? I'm guessing that's this the question that's being asked there.
Yeah, I can take this on. So previously, Ranorex actually had a SpecFlow integration that was specifically so that Ranorex Studio could consume BDD tests. SpecFlow, I think, has been deprecated somewhat recently, and so right now we're actually looking to integrate Rec and Roll. Hopefully, within the next few months, we should have development work on that completed, so that we'll have a BDD integration on Ranorex Studio.
And just to say too, BDD is just naming conventions.
Mm.
You can make any test framework BDD by just using descriptive test names and descriptive assertions. We actually have a an article on the Ranorex blog about it, how to do BDD with Ranorex. But yeah, you could do BDD with anything. The only thing some of the BDD frameworks, like even Cucumber, do is they map, like Cucumber maps real language to code via regex. But if you know how to write code, you don't really need the regex. You can just thoughtfully name things and use actual code.
Yeah. And I'm being reminded in the chat that that Behave is a Python BDD framework, and I'm the dumb marketing guy for not understanding that initially. So I apologize for butchering that question. The other question you had was, where is this presentation? Where can I find it? We're going to be sending this all as a follow-up, so no worries there. Thank you for that question. All right, let's keep it rolling. We have some good amount of time. Um, Here's a good question. I think we've touched on maybe what I think is the right answer, but what is the most common, biggest challenge in maintaining an automated test suite? Any takers?
Devin, do you want to take that or?
Oh yeah. I mean the most common ones I've seen in my career are flaky selectors, timing issues, and like dirty test data and test environments. Um, which is why having a selector strategy is extremely important because that handles a big chunk of it. If you're using your accessibility selectors, if you have a dedicated like test automation attribute that you can use, that again, eliminates a big chunk of it. And then using explicit weights, um, there are various frameworks that will have like built-in explicit weights. With Ranorex, you can add a weight just by like click, drop down, add weight. Um, and then with the test data, if you're able to use programmatic test data, that's great. That would just be, making a quick API call or just explicitly stating like what type of test data needs to be done. And then, data environments, that's going to be collaborating with your DevOps people to make sure that you're able to test against something that mirrors prod as closely as possible.
Yeah, and kind of building on that, being able to control your data is extremely important. You don't want your test to be based on anything that's in any way random. I've done automation in the past where our database would be overwritten with production data, on a weekly basis. That was not a lot of fun to maintain because you couldn't count on your data. And so we worked with our DevOps team to make sure that we had as much control over that as possible. I think also just a core concept of test automation kind of factors into this too. Don't ever repeat yourself. So if you have a test, for example, that it goes through a user creation flow, and then once a user is created, then it goes through some other flow that requires a validated user. Don't have that be a single test. Have a test that tests the user creation and then asserts that that's successful. For your next test, you can just hit the API and generate that user and then insert it and then begin your UI flow from there.
If I may add something on top of all of this, it obviously depends on your setup, but from a test management and a maintenance perspective, a lot of times what ends up happening is manual testers get there first, right? And exactly what we're talking about here, the connection between Ranorex and automated test framework and together with TestRail is the fact that a lot of times these teams are working separately in their own silos. They don't have visibility. It's ongoing. So there's a disconnect between the pace that the manual testing team is going at versus the automation one. That's exactly one of the things that we're trying to tackle with this integration, right? Surface all results, all updates in a single centralized place. So both teams have visibility of the work that's being done. That's another key piece that I would add to making sure that your automated test suite is up to date, is making sure that both teams, again, it depends on your setup. It could be both teams are the same in your case, but a lot of the times they're not. And ensuring both teams are communicating and staying in sync is probably one of the most important pieces as well, especially because you should almost always be using your manual tests as the baseline to create your automated ones in the first place.
Excellent. We've been talking a little bit about test automation side. I think you just brought up some good points in the test management side. So I'm just going to segue into a handful of questions that are coming over there. So, but the first question I want to ask is, someone would like some clarification on what do we mean by quality by design? Patricia, you kind of mentioned that in your part of the presentation. You want to take a lead on that one?
Yeah, this question makes totally sense because being in the industry for more than a decade, I've seen different phases of quality, what it's quality, what it means, who is responsible for the quality. And we now see that the quality isn't just a phase, it's just the endpoint in the line of the development life cycle, of the software development life cycle, in which someone comes in, test and check if it's working correctly or not. We need to work towards quality since the beginning, since the moment that we sit around the table and let's refine and decide which are the features that will come up, what we'll go to implement. Is this going toward what the client wants, or this will just be prettier? As Evan was saying, is the buttons doing exactly what it's being done? Was that thought, or we assume that something was worked and no one even had the time to think and to write something about it? So when we move the quality to the beginning, so quality by design, we will have much more value in the overall process. And as also, we will tend to avoid rework, wasting time, and we know that time is money. We are in a moment in which CI/CD, the pipelines, everything, it's working so fast, it's running so fast that we need answers as soon as possible. So if we take a look on the quality as soon as possible, everything will be much smoother and more precise, and we will achieve that expected quality that everyone wants.
Awesome. And as I mentioned, kind of switching to the test management side of the equation, there's a handful of questions around a similar topic of like, why do we connect test automation with test management, and what is the role of test management in this current environment, modern QA workflows where manual and automation are sort of being pulled together? I think we have some points of view on this. So we'll start with one concisely, and then we'll see if we can answer all of them. We already have test automation. Why connect it to TestRail?
So when you don't know what you are testing, how can you know that you are testing correctly and you are achieving the results that you are expecting? And if we don't have a common source of truth, a single source of truth, I want to say, how do we know that we are achieving the results that we want? So the test management, it's part of all the process independently if it's a manual testing or an automated testing. We need to have results and we need to have them visible. So TestRail comes to take the place of the test management tool and framework in which everyone, if it's a tester, a manager, developer, a stakeholder, can enter and see the starting point of all the workflow, all the results, anytime. As I mentioned, we are living in these fast-paced environments, and we need answers to yesterday is already late. So if we have a framework in which we can enter and see a dashboard with on-fly results, and we can know at early in the morning when everyone comes in, we know the results from the pipelines that has run during the night for the automation results, and we know if that release is ready or not to be deployed. This is so valuable, and if all these values, all these results are not handled in just one single source of truth, all the results will be much more difficult and quality will be missed for sure.
I can give a real life example. When I had worked for a role, we used TestRail, and we had to coordinate new site launches across teams around the world. So we would create open TestRail. We would create tasks needed for testing. So somebody needed to create the email images. Somebody needed to set up the automated emails for different segment events. Someone needed to get the images and design for the new sites ready. So we were able to assign all these tasks within TestRail. All stakeholders were able to log on and see where everybody was in their assigned tasks. We were able to do the testing in 3 different environments on 3 different dates and see the results of each one. We were able to collect our test order numbers, all of the data, and we were able to store it within TestRail. So if there was ever an issue, we had complete observability into the entire testing process. We knew who generated the data, who created the images, when it was done. And then after we automated the test, we were able to go forward. And then when something broke and somebody said, when was the last time this test passed? We were able to go back and see exactly that. And then we had all of the data that we had collected during that run. So it really helped with postmortems. It really helped with traceability, observability, and also just accountability. It was extremely easy to see if you have a system where teams all over the world all have to do their part. It's very easy to see if you need to follow up with anybody, if you're able to keep it contained. So.
Awesome. There is another question on this topic. So there's 3 or 4 people asking about this, but specifically the interesting angle on this one is how do you execute automated tests from TestRail? I think that's a topic that we love to talk about because there's some unique capabilities in there that often people don't know about and are surprised to learn about. George, do you want to take a lead on that one?
Yep. I'll take a stab at it. Patricia, make sure to add any details if I miss anything. There's, I think, 2 essential pieces here. One of them is custom UI scripts. So at TestRail, you have the ability in your admin dashboard to go and leverage, again, custom UI scripts. These are scripts you can write, which in turn, one of their biggest use cases is to trigger automated tests. You can configure at the project level, page-specific buttons in TestRail that trigger specific actions. In this case, you would likely want to create a custom UI script for your bespoke setup that enables you to, or your team, at the click of a button, to trigger a CI/CD pipeline somewhere, which in turn runs your tests. That's one way you can go about it. The second one, and a lot of times again, keep me true, Patricia, but I think customers actually end up using both in tandem, is also leveraging the TestRail webhooks. So there's also certain things that happen in TestRail that you might think, wait, whenever a test run is created, I want to trigger X, or whenever a test is updated, it's up to you. You name it. Again, set up webhooks from the TestRail admin panel. Make sure those end up triggering your CI/CD pipelines or your automated tests. And those are 2 ways. One manually, again, based on user actions. The other one automatically based on changes in the TestRail application. Those are the 2 best ways you can, again, trigger test automation via TestRail. Patricia, did I miss a third or fourth?
You totally wrap it. And it's important to mention that because there are many persons that got confused about the TestRail being the framework that execute the tests. We are a test management tool, but we provide functionalities as as George mentioned, the custom UI scripts and the webhooks that will allow you to trigger external frameworks to then execute and run your results and have your results back to TestRail, and again have all the visibility for the results in just one place.
Let me add just one more detail again. Yes, TestRail does not execute the results itself. It does consume the results, but also it acts as a repository for the tests themselves. So you can not only push your automated tests into TestRail, so your teams using TestRail can see what tests are being run. Then again, specific automated test failed. We're nearing a release. I need to understand what failed instead of having to jump through different tools and different teams and whatnot. I can go ahead and look at that test case. You want something more that I think almost all frameworks don't offer standard out the box. You can go look at history. Go look at how has this paste consistently been failing? Has it not? So again, there's some additional layers of metadata that you get by making sure your tests are being uploaded to and results are also being uploaded into TestRail that you get by using the centralized system. Again, everything's in one place, increases team productivity. And again, there's cases where having some redundancy for both teams is positive. I think this is an exact, or it's a perfect example of that. Let your automation team still have visibility to where they're used to working, but the team who's working in TestRail, let them also have visibility of what's going on the other side.
All right. Excellent answers. We are nearing the end. I like to end these things a little bit early just to give everyone some time before the next call. We're all very busy. So we got maybe time for one more, and this is an easy one. Aaron, you're going to be on point for this one. We already use TestRail for manual testing. Where should automation actually start? I think this is a good one for a lot of folks. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's difficult just to know where to start.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole point of test automation is to expedite the testing process, specifically, usually regression testing, where you're crawling through the entire application, testing all the hot points. If you have well-documented test cases, you probably have an idea of what is the highest priority stuff, and you also have an idea of what you have to test the most frequently. And what you want to find to start off with is the intersection of those two. What are the steps that you're constantly having to retest? What are the things that are highest priority? Whenever those two intersect, start there. That's where you want to be. Mission critical and stuff that's very repetitive. The repetitiveness of manual testing is really the whole reason that test automation exists. So, also identifying things where it's like, wow, I've had to test this 5 times in the span of this. Maybe there is a test case that's vital where we have to create 10 users in order to test a specific scenario. That's ripe for automation. So automate repetition, automate high priority.
If I may add one last TestRail side note to this is out of the box, TestRail also comes with a pre-built is automated field, which again, we recommend our customers use to tag. Again, you can use labels as well for that purpose, but it's important for the manual teams to be able to tag and say, this test is at a status where it's ready to be automated. So again, follow the same steps Aaron just said. What are the most repetitive and most important? Give your teams the ability to, in this one centralized tool, flag which ones are ready to be automated and also flag the ones that are already automated. Again, how both tools can work in tandem to make your life a bit more productive.
Excellent. I think that's about going to wrap it up. I see there's a handful of questions that we weren't able to get to. Thank you for asking them. If you want to ask some follow-ups, an easy place to start is you can either attend our bi-weekly live demos that we do for TestRail and Ranorex, and you'll connect with one of the experts here and we can just ask those. We love those types of questions in those forums. You can submit a contact us, or if you're an existing customer, just reach out to the support and we'll get you routed to the right place. Thank you, Devin and Patricia, for walking us through an excellent presentation. Thank you, George, Aaron, and Rhett. Rhett was not speaking on here, but he was supporting us in the background for all the great insights on the questions. And I appreciate everyone who attended today. Have a great day, and we will see you later.